Kaiji Ultimate Survivor, or Gambling Apocalypse Kaiji, is easily one of my most favorite pieces of anime/manga ever created. If you look past the seemingly crude art style, you get an incredibly tense and psychological gambling series with some unique takes on classic games. Created by Nobuyuki Fukumoto, who has been mainly writing different gambling-themed manga series since 1980, has a talent for exploring and creatively expressing the psyche of the characters that engage in high-stakes games of chance. Besides Kaiji, which easily is his most popular work, at least outside of Japan, he also is the author of Akagi, a mahjong series best known for having a match that took 20 years. Being a mahjong player himself, many of Fukumoto's works are actually based around it. Part of what makes Kaiji so successful is the fact that it features several different games as the series goes on instead of just focusing on one, all of them being very simple games that everyone would know, such as rock, paper, scissors, but often putting a spin on the rules that add a lot more strategy to how you go about them. The series was also a big inspiration for the popular show Squid Game. Now, I don't want to spend the whole video gushing about Kaiji, as if you're watching this, you're probably familiar with the series already, but in case you haven't, I highly recommend you give it a shot. And there's already a lot of other videos talking about how great it is. What I do want to talk about are the video games that were made based on the Kaiji series. By the way, none of the games go beyond the first part or season of Kaiji, so as long as you're up to that point, you don't need to worry about any spoilers. And even then, I won't be mentioning any more than necessary, so you can still go and enjoy the show even after watching this video. Despite being a series about games, most of the games featured in Kaiji are about psychological warfare, which doesn't translate very well into a video game, but there have been quite a few attempts made at adapting it, especially if you include pachinko, or rather patchy slot and mobile games, but I don't really want to waste my time with those, even though the only way you'll get to see any of Kaiji animated past part 2 is those damn patchy slot machines. Instead, I'll be focusing on the games that were released on consoles, of which there are 3. Instead of going chronologically through them though, we'll actually cover the games in reverse order of release, as just like my hopes for season 3 of the anime, the quality of these games has plummeted drastically over time. The first 2 games are pretty low quality, but the last one is an incredibly strange game with a much more unique take on the manga. They're all weird games, so I recommend having a look at all, but if you want to skip to a particular part, I've included chapters in this video splitting up the games. Starting with Kaiji Steel Beam Crossing of Despair, or Kaiji VR. Released on the Nintendo Switch on December 28, 2017, it's actually a port of a PlayStation VR game that came out on August 28th of the same year. It was a digital-only title, and at the time of this video's release, it seems like the game has been quietly pulled from both PlayStation and Nintendo storefronts. Thankfully, it has been preserved, so we can have a look at what this weird thing was, because calling it a game is a bit of a stretch, as I would say it's more of an interactive experience. It was developed by Solid Sphere, who seem to be your classic tech startup kind of company that checks all the boxes, being involved in making mobile apps, VR/AR, as well as AI and blockchain. I'm playing the Switch version for this video, which contains the same content as the PlayStation VR title, but has some obvious differences in how you control things. Kaiji VR covers the events of the second game that's featured in the Kaiji series, the Steel Beam Crossing. If you're unfamiliar with that part of the story, the protagonist, Kaiji, is in big debt and finds himself joining a mystery game set up by a powerful shady company called Tei to free himself from his financial troubles. The game ends up being walking along these long beams to the other side. With the drop being quite high, falling would definitely result in some bones getting broken or worse. You take control of Kaiji in first person as you replay a recreation of these events. It's not the prettiest thing to look at, in fact, it looks quite basic and rushed, just meeting the most basic requirements of being close enough to the source material. Most of the game involves standing around and listening to characters speak. You can move your head around at most points of the game, which for the PlayStation VR would mean actually turning your head around, but for the Switch, it means holding either of the shoulder buttons and moving the console around. The thing is, it's just a camera that's put in front of Kaiji's face, so if you ever look back, you will get a mouthful of Kaiji's beautiful nose. At certain points, you will be required to move along the beam, which means just holding up until you reach a specific location where more cutscenes happen. The only bit of gameplay here is that sometimes you will start to lose balance. You will then need to rotate the controller or console to gain control again and be able to continue walking. If you do fall, which is pretty hard to do, you will have to restart the level. You can skip the parts that don't involve you walking by holding Y on the Switch. There is a bit of nuance to this whole thing because you can lose in other ways than just failing the balancing minigame. You are intended to follow the events as they happen in the manga. For example, at certain point of the walk, the person in front of you will get scared and walk a lot slower. The poor excuse for an audience is screaming for you to push him. If you walk into him at that point, you seemingly attempt to push him only to fall yourself. I guess you could say it makes this somewhat of a puzzle game, as you have to try and figure out what you need to do to progress. But I would have to be the most generous person in the world, because even knowing how the story goes, I was still confused by what was going on sometimes. If you're familiar with how this arc ends, you'll also know how stupid the final quote-unquote solution is. Anyway, if you don't go too fast, all 3 of the people on our beam fall on top of it, meaning they are physically safe but disqualified from the game. They are, however, offered a second chance. This time they have to cross an electrified beam between 2 buildings, a fall from which would result in certain death. Just like the original story, we get a couple of cutscenes of Tonegawa and Kaiji making speeches. You can get some incredibly uncomfortable close-ups of Kaiji's snoot, and I'm also a big fan of how for one of the cutscenes you can't even see the person speaking as he's directly behind Kaiji's head. It's pretty much more of the same. I guess I can't really comment on the immersion of this as I'm not playing it in VR, but I somehow doubt it would have made things better. Not speaking Japanese may have contributed to me not fully understanding what's going on, but in this stage I certainly had a lot of deaths I can't explain. My first time around I was blown off by the strong winds, very unceremoniously I might add. Kaze! I thought it might have been because I was moving my camera around too much, so the second time around I held it still, but still got blown off. For the third time, I had several cutscenes trigger before I even got to that point. You get to see where Ishida gives Kaiji his ticket. It's quite sad. You can look back to see his last moments before his fall. There's one of Sahara confronting a ghost, and this one where you get to go to space. This is as close as this game gets to recreating Kaiji's visual metaphors for things. After this, I was able to cross the gusts of wind without any trouble, and the story continued. Sahara makes a run and jumps for the end only to be blown away by the Tei agents opening the door, creating a strong gust of wind. If you've seen the show, you'll remember the ridiculous solution to this, which is the glass staircase that is apparently near invisible until it's not. Maybe it's supposed to be a reference to how they're so focused on the beam that they're just weren't paying attention. I don't know. I tried looking around, but it's not like there was much else I could do. I decided to follow forward and, unsurprisingly, got the same treatment as Sahara before I even got to the end. It's at this point where I found some small glitches. Ignoring the obvious clipping on the dude right in front of you, you can actually skip gameplay sections using Y. If you keep holding it after to skip a cutscene, it will just skip everything one by one until you let go. If you skip too far though, you will soft lock yourself and have to restart. Also, if you skip this particular cutscene, the camera will permanently get stuck in this position for the rest of the game, even if you fall and have to restart. Now, to actually beat the game properly, what you have to do is look to your left, but after Kaiji finishes talking. Eventually, a cutscene will trigger where the glass stairs appear and Kaiji climbs up to victory. You are rewarded with an Evangelion congratulations screen and Old Man Peanut Nose menacingly laughing. Now again, despite this being listed as a game, it really isn't one. It's just another VR experience. Too bad it's adapting probably the least interesting part of Kaiji, but it's the only one that kinda makes sense for this type of VR thing. There isn't much else to say about this. You can select which stage you want to start with, but it doesn't offer anything to make it stand out, not even alternate paths you could explore. The whole thing takes under an hour, and even as a fan of Kaiji, I wouldn't recommend it and don't really understand why it exists in the first place. I give it not a real game out of 10. Before I move on to the next game, I would like to talk about the music of the games I'm covering. It's not good. So while I usually like to use soundtracks of the games I'm covering for my videos, this time I decided to use songs from animes composed by Hideki Taniuchi. While you probably may not be familiar with the name, chances are if you watched anime, you are familiar with his works, because besides being the composer for both seasons of the Kaiji anime and Akagi, he's most famous for having worked in Death Note, alongside Yoshihisa Hirano. All those series have incredible music that just fits so perfectly and enhances the experience of watching those shows. Unfortunately, in 2012 he was arrested on possession charges, which is something that Japan is known to be very serious about. There are several theories floating around whether he actually went to prison or not, but either way, because of the huge stigma associated with such things, especially in Japan, it did essentially mean the end of his career, unfortunately, as the last thing he worked on was Season 2 of Kaiji, which released all the way back in 2011. Next up is Gyakkyou Burai Kaiji, Death or Survival, or Kaiji DS. Released on the, you'll never guess it, Nintendo DS on September 25th, 2008. Developed by Compile Heart, which is a subsidiary of Idea Factory and are probably most known for making the Hyperdimension Neptunia games. This is essentially a shovelware game, and it was nominated for Kusoge of the Year, Kusoge meaning literally game. It's not really hard to see why from the start, as you're welcomed by crusty screenshots from the anime and repetitive bit-crushed music. I was a bit worried before playing this game that covering it would mean spoiling pretty much all of Season 1 of Kaiji, but this game deviates from the story that it really isn't much of an issue. A lot of the things were changed which alter the context of what's going on, and it doesn't really reflect the main appeal of Kaiji anyway. As a result, I will keep most mentions of the story brief and only say as much as needed to give context to what's going on, with a bigger focus on gameplay and mechanics. Unsurprisingly, this game doesn't have an English patch, so it was a bit struggle to understand everything, and it is very text heavy with all the cutscenes. I tried following along using a translator to get a decent understanding of what was happening, but with most of it just being a retelling of the story, skipping it didn't feel like such a big deal. I still try to translate more important parts to get a better understanding of the mechanics and the differences from the source material. The beginning of the story is mainly the same, with Kaiji being informed that he's in big debt and being offered to go on a ship called Espoir to gamble it away. The game they have to play on the ship is restricted rock, paper, scissors. To go over the rules quickly, it's a variation on the rock, paper, scissors game, but instead of using your hand, you're giving 4 of each type of card. You then challenge other players and bet your stars. If you lose all your stars, it's game over. To win, you need to use up all 12 of your cards and must have at least 3 stars by then. There is a time limit technically, but it never becomes an issue as it only counts down when you're picking opponents, and 10 minutes get deducted when you play against someone. The board that shows how many cards are in play is also irrelevant here. After a bunch of cutscenes, we're finally able to start playing. You get a selection of several opponents. It doesn't really matter who you pick right now, just don't pick the first guy. If you watch the anime, you will recognize him, but he essentially tricks you into automatically losing twice. This only happens if you pick him as your first opponent though. Challenge anyone else and you'll have a standard rock, paper, scissors match. Now you can keep doing these random matches for the entire thing until you use up all your cards, but what you are meant to do is speak to this guy a few times. Eventually, you'll gain the ability to cheat. Well, not exactly, but now, before each game, a short cutscene will play out that will tell you what card the opponent will play. For the purpose of this video, I'll refer to them as cheat sequences. To quickly go over these, you have one where a card is picked and then shuffled around. Follow it until the card gets uncovered and you'll see what they played. Another one where a card moves across the screen and you can see what it is in the reflection. One where all the cards are shown in bursts, then either a card will be selected, which you will have to remember, or if no arrow appears, it will be whatever card there was the most of. For the last one, you'll get shown a hand, then again with one card hidden. Whichever card is the hidden one is what the opponent will play. This is pretty much it. You can talk to your buddies who will give you some hints on how to interpret the previously mentioned cheat sequences, and you can have a cigarette break which advances the time and changes the opponents that are available to challenge. The opponents themselves don't matter that much either. A character will always have the same cheat sequence, so if you find one easier than the other, you can focus on challenging them more often. They will never refuse if you choose to challenge them. After using up all 12 cards and having at least 3 stars, you will be able to progress, but this is where the game deviates from the story a little. A part of what makes Kaiji so great is that he isn't some genius shonen protagonist who always wins, but this is a video game, so you are expected to win. Otherwise, it's just game over and you go back to the start. So how do we deal with this so we can have Kaiji compete in more games? Just say fuck you to the player and tell them they ain't getting Yeah, so you're denied any winnings and are forced to continue playing another game. We move on to the Steel Beam Crossing featured in the previous game. This is an actual minigame finally. It's nothing amazing, but it's the most video gamey part of this whole game. You move around the red reticule to walk around the beam. The closer you put it to the top screen, the faster you walk, stopping if you move it all the way down. The beam will sway, so you'll have to make sure to keep the red reticule centered, and if it goes outside of the beam, you automatically fall. If you're slightly off center, the bigger yellow crosshair will also move, and you will need to adjust to bring it back to the center. If the crosshair gets too far, it'll start a sequence where you'll have to slide your stylus back and forth on the screen quickly to regain balance. This is where I started to question whether this game was even playtested, as it's near impossible to save yourself from it. It genuinely did not matter how much I tried, I always fell. I played this game both on actual hardware and emulator. On my DS, I was able to do it only once, but on emulator, even when slowing down time, it didn't matter what I did, I was never able to regain balance. If you do fall, you have the option of taking a penalty, which lowers your reversal meter. That's this thing on the right side of the touchscreen, we'll come back to it later. Or going all the way back to the beginning of the game with restricted rock, paper, scissors. This is true for all the games coming up from now on. Every 5 meters you travel, a cutscene will trigger. They may seem like checkpoints, but there are no such things here. As you progress, the steel beam will get thinner, making it harder to stay on. Eventually, you will get an option to push the player in front of you, though this choice doesn't seem to have any consequence. There does seem to be a hidden time limit, as the first time I made it through, I was told I failed and had to restart. My guess would be that pushing the player in front of you makes it easier to progress, but honestly, who knows at this point. If you make it through, you're once again denied the win and have to continue to the second part of the steel beam crossing. It's for the most part the same exact thing as before, only there is no time limit and they've introduced a few more mechanics to make it more challenging, although the lack of time limit overall makes it much more easier. The first section is normal, but in the second the beam will start fading in and out. In the section after, these hands will appear which will grab you and you will need to slide your stylus to regain balance. I really thought this was it for my playthrough here, especially because if you fall at any point here, you are sent all the way back to the beginning of the first steel beam crossing, even if you take the penalty. Eventually I realized that you can actually avoid the hands by moving the reticle out of the way before they grab it, which was almost fun to do. The other mechanics introduced are JPEG that covers your screen a little and wind that will push you to one side, and you either have to adjust yourself or stop completely and wait it out. I recommend the second, as falling here would waste a lot of time. I will give this game the tiniest bit of credit for this minigame. It's actually somewhat of a game that has mechanics. I mean, it's not very fun, you get sent back really far if you fail, you get stopped every 5 meters, and it has a mechanic that I believe is just broken. But it is a proper minigame. Anyway, after we make it through, Kaiji gets pranked once again and denied any winnings, forced to play yet another game. Time for rock, paper, scissors again. Oh, sorry, I mean E-cards. Each player gets 5 cards, 4 of which are citizen, then one player also has the emperor card and the other has the slave card. Emperor beats citizen, citizen beats slave, and slave beats emperor. Like I said, basically rock, paper, scissors. You play 3 games with either the emperor or the slave card, then switch with the opponent. If you draw, you continue the game until one person wins or 4 consecutive draws happen. Kaiji also has a little drill in his ear, which he bets the amount it will travel. At first the bets are locked to 1mm and you have 30mm before Kaiji loses the ability to appreciate stereo sound. You also have a range of minigames you do during the match which can decide the outcome or give you insight into what the opponent might play. Playing the Emperor card will trigger a card flipping minigame where you have to click on the cards that are being opened before the X appears. If you fail too many times, the opponent will usually counter your choice. Playing a citizen or a slave card will trigger a roulette minigame where if you get all of the same card, the opponent will play that card. An Ishida card can also appear here, but if you line him up, nothing happens. If the opponent is placing the first card with the slave set, you play a Simon Says minigame where you have to press the cards in the order they flashed, the last card revealing what they played. Otherwise, you just have to guess. If the opponent is putting the first card with the Emperor set, you play a maze minigame where you get a map of a maze with your location and destination marked. Then you have to traverse the maze in first person, trying to find a card where the blue square was. Uncovering it will reveal what card the opponent played. You can also find random Ishida cards here which will increase the time limit in the maze. Unlike the anime, you have to beat 2 opponents before getting to the main man Tonegawa. The first opponent is a random suit with whom you play a single set, then Endo, which is the guy who first roped Kaiji into gambling on the ship at the very start. You play 2 sets with him, so 6 games, and finally Tonegawa, which consists of 4 sets or 12 games. So in total you have to play 21 games, which is way too much as those minigames get old fast. When you get to Tonegawa, you can finally properly adjust your bet. You need to get 50 coins to proceed with the story, each millimeter being worth 1 coin. As you progress through opponents, the minigames will get more challenging, and Tonegawa will introduce a new card, which is just himself. In the maze minigame, they can appear as the incorrect cards. Opening one teleports you to a random location. In all the other minigames, getting that card means the minigame is automatically failed, and he either counters your card or it becomes a guess to what he played. The card flipping minigame is essentially impossible. If his card appears, you don't even get a chance to close it, hence I don't recommend playing Emperor first with him. It's not too bad overall. You can bet high at the start to get the necessary 50 coins, then just lose all the remaining games to make it go a little bit faster. You have 30mm to work with and 21 games, so not a lot to worry about unless you lose a really big bet. For being such an exciting part of the show, this really doesn't do it justice. After beating E-cards, you have a short minigame where you have to either close your DS or hold A for 10 seconds to punish Tonegawa for losing. If you don't hold it long enough, you lose, and if you hold it too long, you lose. Not sure why they decided to make that a minigame. Even after making it this far, Kaiji's debt is still not cleared, so he challenges the owner of Tei, Old Man Peanut Nose, to a final game. They have to draw a piece of paper that has a circle from a tissue box. I know, riveting, but just wait till you see the gameplay. Yeah, I guess I don't know what I was expecting. This is the only time I noticed the meter on the right being utilized, as it acts as a time limit for you to find the winning piece, which can always be found in the same place, covered by all the blanks. Anyway, after you beat the game, your debt is finally cleared, but Old Man Peanut Nose still pretty much calls us a loser and won't tell us his name. Kaiji goes back home, but instead of the game ending, Endo comes back to him and gives him a ticket to go to Espoir again. Kaiji's gambling addiction is just too strong and he goes back to the ship. making the whole game essentially just start over. How's that for a satisfying ending? Well, if you play through the entire game again after that, you will get an alternate scene where Old Man Peanut Nose reveals his name, which is Kazutaka Hyodo by the way, and we get actual credits for the game. It's a disappointing reward for having to go through this whole thing again, and besides the fact knowing his name doesn't change anything, you probably already knew it anyway if you played this game, as I doubt anyone who isn't familiar with Kaiji would play it. I really cannot recommend playing this game even if you are a huge Kaiji fan. The minigames are very basic, which isn't surprising considering how thin those credits were, and the whole thing just misses the entire point of what makes Kaiji interesting. I give it a out of. To finish off this game, let's quickly talk about the extras. You have a free mode where you can infinitely play in most of the minigames. You have the restricted rock paper scissors minigames, which are picked randomly, steel beam crossing, which combines all of the effects from the second phase, e-card flipping, e-card roulette, Simon Says, and the maze. There's also a gallery that contains all the cutscenes from the game. The settings in this game are incredibly minimal, and lastly, there's a wireless mode, but I don't think I'd want to put anyone through this game, so I left it be. With all that out of the way, let's finally move on to the third and final game, which is actually worth talking about. But quickly before that, I want to mention some lost media games based on Kaiji. There seems to have been a bunch of mobile games released or were planned to be released by Taito back around 2003 to 2004. There's very little information about them, but we do have a few screenshots so we can get an idea of what they looked like. The first game covered the restricted rock paper scissors and even featured a story mode in addition to a score focused ranking mode. The plan was to keep releasing more of these games monthly, moving on to Steel Beam Crossing and e-cards, as well as Chinchirarin and Pachinko from part 2. We have some screenshots of the Steel Beam Crossing, but it's unknown if the other 3 were ever released. Surprisingly, there was one more game they released covering part 3's Minefield Mahjong. This one was part of some monthly subscription service for 315 yen a month, while the others were 300 yen each. It's just another weird part of Kaiji lore. Anyway, on to the main event. Tobaku Mokushiroku Kaiji, released on the PlayStation 1 on May 25, 2000. The title translates to Gambling Apocalypse Kaiji, which is the main name for the manga. It was published by Kodansha, but developed by some company called Computer Software Will. I really wasn't able to find any concrete information about them, unfortunately. This company is a big mystery. While the 2 previous games were pretty much simple retellings of the original story to different extents, this one doesn't follow any specific plot, simply uses the setting of the first game in Kaiji to tell its own story. You don't even play as Kaiji in this game, you play as some random guy who you get to name, who is also in debt and was invited to the ship Espoir. Kaiji does make an appearance but acts more as a friendly face/mentor, giving you some advice on the game. I think this is a great idea as it allows for greater freedom in things you can do and isn't locked to the original story's plot, but still being able to recreate certain events from the manga. This game revolves solely around the restricted rock paper scissors game, which in itself sounds like it would make for a very short game, but it is intended to be replayed several times, with you being able to challenge different opponents and uncover different story paths. As I mentioned before, this is a really interesting game, though it wasn't easy to get through as it's incredibly text heavy, only on Japanese, plus there is a time limit that keeps on going even if you're chatting with other characters. I did several playthroughs of the game trying to figure out and see as much as I could, using translators to get a better context to things, but this is a game I would love to see get a proper fan translation one day. With that out of the way, let's check this game out. Right from the start, I was confused and thought I booted up the completely wrong game as the main character gets dragged down into the void by some dark hands that appeared on the ground. You get a little personality test and some terrifying looking animations in the background. It did seem really weird at first, but Kaiji is a 10 series. Trying to replicate that with horror elements is kind of smart, but I certainly didn't expect anything like that. Maybe because I first played this at 2 AM, but it sure was one way to get me to relate to the main character's feeling of despair. I did translate the questions you get asked, but I'm not fully sure what effect they do have on the game. In subsequent playthroughs, you get to skip through this part anyway. The first question asks, what is the man saying? Help me or let me help you? Then you see a woman and you get asked what is she saying? Either I'm a woman of that time or I'm a woman that you killed. The third question asks you what's inside the coffin, either regret or despair. For the fourth one, you get played 2 sounds and asked which one awakens your hideous memories. With these done, you are presented with a set of cards and a star. You choose which one you would like to pick up first. After this weird little section, we appear in front of the ship and enter inside. There we get explanation of the rules of restricted rock paper scissors and are able to select how much money we want to borrow. Your debt then increases every 10 in-game minutes. I really like that this game includes visual metaphors like the manga. with for example the background turning into a battlefield as the game begins. In one playthrough, I saw the scene of sinking down into the ground several times too. The beginning of the game plays out the same every time. After taking a single step, you are challenged by Funai to a game you cannot refuse. He tries the same trick he does in the manga of convincing you to keep drawing to use up all your cards. The developers were smart in crafting this as they knew most people playing this game would recognize him and expect him to cheat you. But if you follow along and actually put down paper like you agreed, he'll lose thinking that you were going to cheat him. You then play another game where you agree to let him win the star back, but you can backstab him to take another star from him for what he did to Kaiji. This does make him really mad and he attacks you. Whatever the outcome of these two games was, he leaves and then we get to have a chat with Kaiji himself. Unfortunately, in none of my playthroughs I was able to play against him, but he does give you some advice on how you really shouldn't be trusting the people in here, which is a fair point. I'm not sure what Kaiji is doing here in the first place, as this is apparently not his first time here, but he sticks around the stage for most of the game, though doesn't really say much after this part. After our chat, the game properly opens up. You can walk around the ship with the D-pad. The isometric perspective makes controlling your character a little awkward, especially when trying to line up to properly speak to people. You can't interact while holding any direction either, so you usually need to line up diagonally first to interact with most people. Holding X makes you walk slower, and square opens up the chapter list. You can see all the chapters unlocked here, as well as alternate paths or scenes you have taken or seen in current and previous playthroughs, signified by the letters. Triangle opens up your menu where you can see your mental state and an intuition gauge. The mental state is represented by the heart rate monitor, and the higher it is, the quicker the time goes, which can be seen in the bottom right of the screen. You get 4 in-game hours to get rid of all your cards and have at least 3 stars. Intuition allows you to see whether a character can give you intel or can be challenged to a game. If it's too low, all characters will display this chat box above them when facing them. If your intuition is very high, different icons will appear depending if they have information or can be battled. Though I had times where they had the battle icon but wouldn't agree to it still. If it's around medium levels, both of those icons will be question marks instead. At max, your controller will vibrate at certain points when characters are speaking, which is meant to give you hints. Approaching any character will also show you their name and how many stars they have at the bottom of the screen. In the triangle menu, you also have a few options. The top one is strategy. You can learn new strategies throughout the game, which you can practice and review here. I'll get back to this later. Below strategy, you have data on the people on the ship. Talking to different characters will result in you getting intel on what cards they hold, what cards they played recently, and other details about them or their playstyle. You can review any information gathered here. The bottom option is your items. The 2 main items are cigarettes, which you can use to calm your mental state, but in the process will lose some intuition, and chewing gum, which increases your intuition. Also, winning games will increase both intuition and mental state, while losing will decrease them. Now that we can walk around, let's explore the ship. There are only a total of 4 different rooms in this game. You have the main hall where you spend most of the game, a rest area that sometimes has people you can talk to, the toilets which are pretty empty, and a big, almost empty room except for a single PC at the back which you can use to save the game. You can go into the rest area and talk to the 2 guys to get some intel on other players. There's also this guy in bright clothes who will sell you information in exchange for money. If you buy all 3, he'll even throw in a free cigarette. After playing a game with an opponent, you will start talking to this guy who is just wasting time observing people, but he does give us 2 pieces of intel. One about a guy who has 2 of each card, and another about someone who has 4 paper and 1 rock. The obvious choice is playing scissors against the second guy. He'll probably want to save the rock to not be stuck with just paper, but that would result in you losing. He'll always play rock at that time, as if he knew that you are aware of his cards, or maybe he just has a weird strategy. This is the kind of thinking this game expects from you, and it's crazy how they found a way to mimic the experience of playing restricted rock paper scissors in a unique way. The information you get isn't 100% reliable either. Again, these people don't care about you, they're also just trying to win themselves. Not being able to understand the text in this game does hamper the experience a lot though. You miss out on most of the clues and little details that would help you play this game with more strategy than just randomly picking cards. There are a lot of different situations that may happen. One of the people I challenged dropped his cards right in front of me, letting me see everything he had, which was 1 rock, 2 scissors, and 3 paper. He didn't ask me if I saw anything, which I could say the truth or lie to give myself an advantage. If you do lie, he will put down paper as that is the card he has the most of, but telling the truth will make him choose rock in an attempt to trick you, as he wouldn't normally want to get rid of all of one type of card. So, characters don't play random cards. If you were to revert to a previous save, they would always play the same card, but it seems there are more factors that influence that choice. For example, on my second playthrough, Funai would always win the first match, no matter what card I played. The amount of playthroughs you do is tracked in the chapter menu, so it may be that that also has influence on things. Either way, I hope you can see what this game is all about. It really tries to put you in the hot seat of someone on the ship and makes the other characters feel a lot more real. I did mention there are strategies you can learn. At the beginning of the match, you select one strategy you will take. The main one you have is just using your own intuition, which just means directly picking the card yourself. Throughout the game, you will learn more strategies that might be helpful to consider when making your choice. For example, trying to keep the amounts of different cards similar so you don't run out of one and limit your options. Or looking at the board to see which cards are most and least likely to show up. This one will automatically lock you to a card that's least likely to lose based on the cards played. You can even learn Funai's technique of asking people for a draw with the ability to cheat them. As you unlock them, they'll appear grayed out in your strategies menu. You can go into them to get an explanation and play some practice rounds of how the cards would have been played to get the desired effect. After you complete it, the strategy becomes usable during the match. Some other players will also just straight up cheat. One guy looks at the reflection of your cards and swaps his out last second. There's another person who tells you about it and teaches you the same trick. You have to do a little minigame where you time your button presses to swap and take back the card. After which you can perform this trick on the guy who scammed you in a big bet. You don't actually need to perform the button presses again though, as it happens automatically. After you win, the guy who taught you the trick attacks you with some of his friends and takes all the stars you won though. There's also another pair of characters where when you play against one of them, the other one will look at your card from the back and signal his friend, making you lose no matter what. At one point in the story, this old man starts throwing hand signs that manipulate his opponents into playing a card he wants, and he can also read minds. If you challenge him, you will lose your first match, but you can figure out what he's doing by going through a set of multiple choice questions and getting your revenge if you get them correct. This game is full of encounters like that, and it's impressive what they managed to achieve with what I assume is not a big budget. It really was ahead of its time, and for a PS1 game, it looks pretty good. Even the music is a hell of a lot better than either of the previous games. Another really cool thing about it is that if you try to save scum by resetting the console, one of the suits will pop up upon reloading your save and make you clean windows as a punishment, which if you decide you don't want to do, your save file will be deleted instead, which is really funny and I have a lot of respect for. As for the minigame itself, you have to alternate pressing up and down on the D-pad to clean the window, left and right move your character, and circle turns him around. When turned away from the window, up and down then controls the left side of the lift, while triangle and X control the right. If you tilt one side too much, you will slide off and have to restart the cleaning. Left and right also move the lift to the sides, but it only worked for me when I was all the way at the top. Objects can fall from the sky, which will knock you off the lift, making you lose, and you can also have more bird poop drop, which you'll have to clean up again. Once you clean all the windows, you will be returned to your last save. Another side thing I want to mention is the area at the bottom of the map guarded by two suits. They'll ask you a bunch of questions about Chohan and Silo. These are gambling games which, if you played Yakuza, you might be familiar with. If you get all the questions right, you get entry into the side casino where you can play both of those games. If you get a question wrong, you can redo the quiz immediately, so trial and error is a viable strategy. In the casino, you can buy chips to play the games and turn them back into money. Remember, you have a debt that increases every 10 minutes, so if you don't want to leave this ship with even more debt, this is a good place to make sure you don't end up in the red. I won't go over the rules as those are just the standard games they're based on, and you don't really do much besides placing a bet and then picking odd or even, or just throwing dice in Silo's case. Well, there is one thing. I haven't mentioned before, but you can interact with random objects around the map, which sometimes can yield items. This counter in the rest area has a chewing gum you can find, for example, but you can also find weighted dice. I found one in the side room that always rolls a 6, and two others in the bathroom stall and near the card display that always roll a 1. You can use these during Silo by holding either R1, R2, or L1 to change one or more of the dice to the weighted ones. They can get suspicious of you, like when I tried to use all three at the same time and they took away all the dice and chips I had. It's a very cool addition to the game that I didn't expect once again. In fact, at a later point in the game, I ended up with a lot of stars but couldn't find anyone to get rid of my last card. Talking to this guy forced me into a game that lost me 4 stars and all my money. On another playthrough, I got to the same point, but I had a lot of chips still. I was able to go back and exchange it for money to avoid the debt. If you don't have the cash when the time runs out, but you manage to get the stars, you can sell them off at the end of the game. You get an extra 10 minutes where you can buy or sell stars. It's getting rid of cards that is a bigger hassle. Ending up in debt does let you leave the ship unharmed, but it's not credits worthy, and you just get a piece of paper reminding how much you owe. Oh, what happens if you lose the game, by the way? Well, you get quite a horrific cutscene where the main character gets dragged off by the suits into an operating room, which has some pretty bad implications for his future. The final encounter I'll mention is of a person that appears later in the game inside the quiet room. Interacting with them reveals it's a woman whose art style does not match anything else in the game. And it's not just because it's a female character. There's another one who hangs around in the main room, but she looks completely fine. This one is an idol, however, which is why she was trying to hide her face with a hat. She only has 1 star and card left and asks you for help. Interacting with her forces you into a game where you have to bet 2 stars to her 1, and if you let her win, she hands you a note and leaves. If you manage to escape the ship alive, you will get a cutscene of the main character visiting her home, only for a car to drive out where she can be seen with someone else. I guess love cannot bloom on the battlefield. Winning the game with spare cash plays another cutscene of you exiting the ship, seeing some of the players walking off, and then a zoom in onto what looks like Kaiji, but he looks like he started balding really badly. Then we see the ship drift off into the distance. Another really surprising thing about this game is that it's compatible with the Pocket Station accessory, a Japan-only device that shares a lot of similarities with the visual memory unit of the Dreamcast. It was meant for downloading extras from PlayStation games that you could play anywhere. I don't really have a way of seeing what exactly it did, but apparently you were able to use it to play rock paper scissors and even purchase stars, in addition to allowing you to place decorations in the empty save room. I'll leave this game at that. There's definitely a lot more interesting encounters this game has to offer, many of which I probably haven't even seen myself. I feel like there must be some way of being able to play a game against Kaiji himself, and I never managed to get a full score on my report card. I've done around 6 full playthroughs of the game, skipping through most of the text lets you finish it in about an hour and a half. But again, you are intended to keep replaying it for more stories and a better outcome. I've spent even more time playing around with different saves and trying to see different outcomes to choices, but I see myself coming back to this game again at some point to explore what else I missed. This game is a genuine hidden gem on the PS1, in my opinion, and definitely worth a look, especially if you're a fan of Kaiji. Though, you'll probably want to be able to speak Japanese first to truly enjoy it. And that's about it for this video. Thank you for making it this far. Despite the quality of some of these games, it's been a lot of fun revisiting one of my favorite series and discovering a truly unique game. If you haven't watched all of Kaiji yet, I highly recommend you continue it and then read the manga to continue the story. Don't get scared off by Mahjong of Part 3. The story is really worth it and to this day continues to surprise me. If you're interested in seeing more of these games, I've included a bunch of links to different videos and articles, some of which helped me in the research for this video. I hope you found the world of Kaiji video games as interesting as I did, and let me know in the comments what you think of them. Do you think any of them are worth playing today? If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and hitting that subscribe button for more videos like this. Anyway, take care for now.